Beautiful day in Oslo. So I'm glad that so many of you could come up here, even though it's some of these days the Norwegians go to the beach almost. Welcome to this seminar on China in the global community. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, I'll just give a brief advertising. Just out in my shelf, the new edition of International Politik dealing with cyber issues. This is the 71st volume of 71st year of International Politik, edited by this institute. Now, today the topic is China in the global community. I think the speed and scale of China's rise is somewhat without precedent in history. Its economy has grown from being smaller than the Netherlands economy 30 years ago, and now it's the second biggest economy in the world. This has happened in just 30 years. And history tells us about that economic power shifts is also often matched by political power shifts. Such power shifts might also generate conflicts of interest, conflicts of values and worldviews. At the same time, they generate new possibilities for cooperation. And some of these tensions and new modes of cooperation might develop regionally, but they might also arise at the global level. And one of the big topics in international affairs these days is, of course, the interest and perspective of China in the new global community. Another topic relates to the actions and reactions of the West to the emergence of or the rise of China. We see that the US, with its famous pivot to Asia, is adjusting its policies. And we also note that some express more of some kind of strategic uncertainty regarding how to deal with the changing global order. And the seminar today, we hope to deal with both of these two issues, partly the rise of China and its role in the new global community, and some of the adjustments and reflections in the West. Today's speaker is Paul Haenle. Paul is the director of the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy in Beijing. He's been there for 3 years. He has established this institute and made it into probably one of the most important hubs and centers for reflections on international relations in China today. Not only in China, but in Asia in general. Paul has previously served as the director for China, Taiwan and Mongolian Affairs on the National Security Council staffs of former President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama. We're very glad, Paul, that you can take the time to visit us, and we look forward to your speech. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ulf, and thank you to NUPI, the organization here, for hosting me today. It's an honor to be here. This is my first time in Oslo, and it really is a beautiful country, and I hope to have some time. The Foreign Ministry has sponsored me on this trip, and it's been a very busy trip, so I'm hoping that to convince them to give me a little time at the end to see some of the country, because I understand it's beautiful. I look forward to talking to you today about China's global role and China's foreign policy. I also look forward to exchanging some views at the end, hearing some of your views, questions, comments. That's always helpful for me to understand how people are looking at China and the rise of China from other parts of the world. So I look forward to that part. I will try not to talk too long. But I do want to, before I was asked to talk about China's global role, China's foreign policy. But I think before I launch into that, I think it's important to talk about a couple other things to sort of lay the foundation. First is that China just completed its once-in-a-decade leadership change. Which was completed in mid-March at the National People's Congress. And so I think it's important to talk about some of the key features of that leadership change and how the new leaders in China see the challenges before them. And then secondly, to talk about those challenges that they see before them, which you will hear from my talk is primarily domestic challenges at home. China's leaders are very focused domestically, very focused inwardly on the domestic and economic development of their country. And so it's an important piece to understand when thinking about China's international role, because really the priority in China is not on its foreign policy or its external role, it's really at home and to try to solve some pretty significant problems. And what I'll share with you today are my own views based on my own experience in government, 21 years in government, including work at the embassy in Beijing, working in the Pentagon, on the security military side as a China advisor, and then working in the National Security Council at the White House, where our policy is coordinated at the highest level, working on China and North Korea. But my views that I'll share with you today are also from my perspectives over the last 3 years, being in Beijing and developing a joint research center, the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center for Global Policy, in Beijing at Tsinghua University. And what we have done with this partnership is to create a platform where Chinese experts can engage with the experts from the international community, not just the United States, but the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the organization that I'm a part of, is a 100-year-old foreign policy think tank. Our original office is in Washington, D.C., but we, in 1994, opened up an office in Moscow, Russia, which has been open since then and has grown considerably. And 7 and 8 years ago, we opened offices in Brussels, Belgium, which is our Carnegie Europe Center, and Beirut, Lebanon, which is our Carnegie Middle East Center. And so after I left the White House in 2009, I was asked by the Carnegie Endowment if I was interested in going to China and opening up their first center in China at the Carnegie-Tsinghua Center. And this has really been a fascinating endeavor, because the Chinese that I met when I arrived in China at Tsinghua University were not convinced that this was in their best interest. Here was a guy coming out of the White House in the National Security Council. I'd served in the Army for a long time, in the Pentagon, and here I was showing up at Tsinghua University to develop a joint foreign policy center with them. But after we sat down and talked about how we could set it up in a way that would be beneficial to both China, to both Tsinghua University, and to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, it actually was quite easy, because China is at a point where, even though foreign policy right now is not their priority, they are at a point where they realize that given the last 3 decades, as Ulf has mentioned, of considerable economic progress, they have grown in influence and power, and they are now the #2 economy, and they are now very influential in the world. Whether they like it or not, that is the case. And so they recognize that they need to begin to better understand what's happening outside of China. The international environment will affect China. It will affect their own development, and they recognize that they need to understand what the strategic capital is in the world, how they're viewing issues, and how they're trying to engage China. At the same time, all of you understand that the international community, the world outside of China, right now is trying better to understand what's happening in China, the views of the leaders in China, and how countries in the world can begin to cooperate better with China. And so the integration of both the Chinese desire to understand the international community and the international community's desire to understand China has allowed us to create a platform which has been very active, I think, to both the surprise of the Carnegie Endowment, probably to the surprise of our Chinese partners. In the first year, we put together over 100 conferences, seminars, roundtables, And the next year we did 150. And we continue to be very, very active and creating a debate and talking about the issues that China is facing in the international front. So I welcome you to visit our center if you're in Beijing. And like Ulf did, I'll do a little advertising. Our website is www.carnegie-Tsinghua.org. So please take a look. So let me talk about, if I could, the leadership change. I'll start with that. As I mentioned, it concluded in mid-March, and Xi Jinping emerged as the president of the People's Republic of China, as the Secretary General of the Communist Party. But what was interesting is he also took the third position within the most senior power position as chairman of the Central Military Commission. And what's different this time is 10 years ago, when Hu Jintao was elevated to President, Secretary General, Jiang Zemin held on to the Central Military Commission for 2 additional years. And this constrained Hu Jintao's ability to take full reign of power in China. This year, Hu Jintao let the chairmanship of the Central Military Commission go. And this likely reflects a desire on his part to put Xi Jinping and the other leaders in the Standing Committee in the best position to deal with the considerable challenges that they have before them. There is consensus among the top leaders that the challenges that they're dealing with are extremely complex and difficult and will determine the fate of China and the one-party system. So unlike Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping has all 3 of the key leadership positions, and he's expected to hold those for the next decade. This will also be important because Xi Jinping is the first Chinese leader to emerge through consensus without a clear mandate from a previous revolutionary leader. Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, the last 2 leaders, were both selected by Deng Xiaoping, who was a very strong revolutionary leader in China. And so they came into the position with incredible top cover, political top cover, which allowed them to embark on ambitious reforms when needed. Xi Jinping does not have this. He comes up through the system and is selected by consensus among the leaders within the Communist Party. And so he will need to now he will need to move in and to consolidate his base of support. Given that he now has those 3 positions, this will give him more authority, which will allow him to consolidate that base of support, which will be essential for dealing with the difficult set of issues ahead. Another important feature is that the Standing Committee went from 9 leaders down to 7. Which is very difficult to reduce 2 positions, because what happens is these Chinese leaders come up through the system and they're vying for a position on the Standing Committee. And so they position themselves to take certain positions, and when you take 2 away, you create considerable turmoil within the party, as you might imagine, the politics behind it all. So and there was a great amount of debate on whether or not, it was clear that the leadership wanted to reduce the number of positions on the Standing Committee, but what was not clear was whether or not they would be able to do that. And the fact that they were able to reduce it to 7, I think once again also reflects the fact that they understand the challenges are quite complex and will be very contentious in reaching consensus on how to deal with these issues. And it will be easier to reach consensus with 7 on the Standing Committee than 9. In addition to relinquishing the chairman of the Central Military Commission chairmanship, Hu Jintao also announced his intention to leave politics after he retires. Now, we'll wait and see if he does, but this would also be a very different feature, because as Hu Jintao executed his presidency for those 10 years, Jiang Zemin was always in the background and was always weighing in on big key decisions and was very influential in terms of deciding who the next leaders would be in China. And this is how it has been historically. So the fact that Hu Jintao says he's going to step away from politics my own view is that also reflects this desire to put these next leaders in the strongest possible position to deal with the problems that they have before them. And then finally, one last feature which I think is important to note coming out of the political transition. This standing committee, 7 members of the standing committee, historically, the bulk of the standing committee would remain for 10 years. And then they would change out after 10 years. This standing committee, 5 of the members will retire in 5 years. So in 5 years, we will have 5 new standing committee members elevating to the standing committee. And this is fairly significant. And what people look at is who is next in line in terms of seniority, in terms of age. And 2 of them, specifically Wang Yang and Li Yuanchao, are known to be reformers within the system. So there's a lot of speculation about what that might mean for the types of reforms that they implement. So who are these new leaders? Well, much is still unknown about Xi Jinping, about his personality, about his resolve to reform. But what we can tell right away is that he is much more charismatic and personable than his predecessor, Hu Jintao, who was quite reserved. Xi Jinping is a princeling, which means he comes from a family of a revolutionary family. And he comes from a family with reform credentials as well. Xi Jinping served in the military early on in his career as an aide-de-camp to the Minister of Defense in the 1970s. And so he is often portrayed as somebody who can take on the military establishment. This was a debate when Hu Jintao was in office, the degree to which he could exert his authority over the military establishment was always something that people debated. Given that Xi has some military experience, Xi Jinping, people think that this can put him in a good position. Xi Jinping has come out early in his tenure to present a more positive and open style of leadership. He introduced early on in his speeches the idea of the China dream and the great renaissance or the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. He has made it clear that he admires Deng Xiaoping, who had implemented the economic reform and opening up in the early 80s. And in this sense, I think Xi Jinping is signaling that he has a desire to further the economic reforms. In a very symbolic move, he traveled to southern China, to the city of Shenzhen. This early on, after being elevated to Secretary General, this was the place where Deng Xiaoping in 1992, as part of his famous southern tour, relaunched bold economic reforms after Tiananmen Square. So the signaling here is meant to say, I'm also going to continue these economic reforms. Xi Jinping has also made it clear that cracking down on corruption in China will be a priority for his leadership. And he has talked very plainly about his own concern that corruption could destroy the party. And he has signaled that cracking down will be a priority for his leadership. Finally, he appears to be trying to address the growing social discontent in China and the concerns revolving around the issue of the image of the party elites and princelings. And there is a growing perception of an abuse of power by privileged party elites, and that this needs to be addressed. Xi Jinping is positioning himself as being one with the people. He has traveled early on in his tenure to poor villages and met with rural villagers and has talked to them about their own struggles. He made a high-profile trip to Hebei province, the neighboring province to Beijing, where he sat down with a family of rural villagers and enjoyed a very simple meal of 4 dishes, 1 soup, and no alcohol. And this really made its way around the Chinese social media, a lot of commentary on it, and a lot of press coverage showing that he's a very simple guy and he can relate to the Chinese people. On official trips, he also makes a point of having much less obstructive of a footprint with his own motorcade, taking less vehicles and closing off fewer roads, blocking less traffic. And he has also implemented a less formal and bureaucratic approach, stopping the practice of having officials read long speeches during Politburo meetings and asking officials to speak more extemporaneously. Early on, there was a story that went around that during a Politburo meeting, one of the officials started to read his long speech, and he made a point to say, "I've read your speech, I want to hear what you think." And that really made it around the Chinese social media, a lot of discussion about that, really signaling that he wants to see things differently. Two other standing members worth mentioning, Li Keqiang, who will be his premier, replaces Wen Jiabao, and he will head the State Council and be responsible for the economic policy and day-to-day running of the country. He will be more powerful in his role than Wen Jiabao was, in that as he took the position of premier, it became the number 2 position, the second ranked position in the party. Previously, it was number 3. And this will be important because reforming the economy, as I will talk about, will be, I think, the number 1 priority. The other official, the standing committee member to talk about, is Wang Qishan, who is a proponent of market reforms. He has great amount of experience, especially dealing with senior American officials. He was the U.S. Treasury Secretary's counterpart in the strategic and economic dialogue with the United States. He is given the portfolio of corruption. Wang Qishan is known as somebody who can get something done in China. He also has charisma, and he is known to be a problem solver. So the fact that he was given corruption, people believe that this is a sign that, as the leadership has said, corruption will be a high priority. So what will be the focus of the new leaders in China? The most significant issue that Chinese leaders will take on is related to China's economy. And here I will tell you a story about President Bush when he first met with Hu Jintao when he emerged in 2002 as the new president of China. President Bush had a practice in his initial meetings with heads of state with other leaders to ask them a question, to try to get to know them, to put himself in their shoes. And he would ask them, what keeps you, as leader of your country, what keeps you awake at night? What worries you the most? And President Bush would share his own view. He would say, you know, for me, it's clearly this idea that we would have another 9/11, that the United States would be attacked again, and that several thousand Americans would be killed. When he asked Hu Jintao what keeps him awake, Hu Jintao, without hesitation, responded, the fact that I have to create 25 million new jobs every year. And President Bush was taken aback and thought about it for a second. And, you know, he found it very illuminating. He tells this story often. I think it's in his book as well. But he said that he realized that President Hu and the Chinese leaders are really focused inward, that they're not necessarily focused where the rest of the world thinks they're focused. They're focused on jobs, on the economy, on trying to prevent instability within China and widespread discontent. So this gives you a sense of why reform of the Chinese economy is at the very top of the agenda now for Chinese leaders. But on this issue, at this point in time, it's even more important because China stands at a crucial developmental turning point. The economic model that has lifted hundreds of millions of Chinese out of poverty and brought double-digit economic growth to China since the liberalization 3 decades ago, this economic model has been exhausted. And so Chinese leaders now need to fundamentally transform their economy if they want to avoid the middle income trap and move on to establish a high income competitive economy. As part of this transformation, Chinese leaders have set as a goal to shift from an industrial export-driven economy to an economy that's based on consumption and innovation. Chinese leaders have decided that China's dependency on exports, on state investment in infrastructure, and on cheap labor is no longer sustainable. Economic reform will require strong political will and action. made even more challenging by China's fragile political system, which, as I mentioned, is marked by corruption and deadlock. China's economic rebalancing will require increasing social support programs, reforming the tax system, adjusting the distribution of national income. And as I mentioned before, Xi Jinping will confront these enormous tasks as China's first consensus leader without a clear mandate from one of China's revolutionary leaders. And as such, he will, before implementing these bold economic reforms, he will need to further build credibility and authority and especially to deal with the issues of corruption and restoring credibility with the Chinese people. The prospects that the leadership will try to push for serious near-term economic reforms are high, as the leaders recognize that the party's fate depends on its ability to continue to produce economic growth and increase living standards. However, these economic reforms will be difficult, and they will require leaders to generate political capital and to make real compromises and to spend this political capital to deal with the entrenched invested interests. One important data point from the World Bank when looking at the issue of the middle income trap. In 1960, there were 111 countries that were classified as middle income. In 1985, so 25 years later, only 13 of those 111 had broken through to become high income and competitive economies. And most of the countries that managed to break through, most of those 11, were small entities. Taiwan and other large countries were Japan and South Korea. So 13 out of 111 in 25 years managed to make this transformation. Gives you a sense of the challenge. In addition to the economic reform, the other challenges that the leadership, just some of the other challenges that the leadership will be dealing with. I mentioned to you corruption, also addressing major and growing social discontent and improving efforts to safeguard social justice, dealing with growing inequality in China between the rich and the poor, between the coastal areas and the inland part of China, and between urban and rural. And then finally, this issue of the environment, handling serious issues with regard to the environment. Environmental damage has been largely ignored over the last several decades in pursuit of development and wealth. And so these costs are now creating rising public discontent. You read in the newspapers about the pollution in Beijing. I live in Beijing, and I can tell you it's become a bigger problem. Not only the pollution has become a bigger problem, but the fact that the new leadership has come out and positioned itself as a leadership body that is going to deal with problems and find solutions. And so now you find that Chinese people want to see change, and they want to see things improved. And Bloomberg News article recently said that pollution is the #1 political issue in China now, that Chinese people want to see things change. So this just gives you a sense of some of the domestic challenges, and it's certainly not all of them. It's just, I think before talking about foreign policy, it's important to talk about the challenges that these Chinese leaders face, because this is really where their focus is going to be. While the international community is preoccupied with China's rise and with China's increasing international influence, Chinese leaders continue to avoid seeking a high-profile role for China in international affairs, and foreign policy is not the foremost concern of Chinese leaders. Additionally, in many ways, Chinese leaders still view their country as a developing country and an emerging nation, and they feel that China is at a vulnerable stage in its own evolution, and they are fearful of China overreaching on the international stage or becoming too involved internationally. Evidence of this can be seen by examining the work report that comes out of the 18th Party Congress. This is the key document that will guide China's policy for the next 5 years. In that report, less than 10% addresses the issue of China's external role or foreign policy. And anecdotal evidence suggests that discussions within the Standing Committee, within the Politburo, have a similar breakdown. Less than 10% of the discussion is dedicated to foreign policy. Notwithstanding this fact, given China's remarkable economic progress, China is now in a position to be able to contribute to achieving progress on common global challenges. In some cases, we are beginning to see a more pragmatic approach by China and a more active foreign policy, and a shift away from long-standing principles of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. But I would argue that we see this only in cases where Chinese leaders see strong economic, commercial, or energy interests. In Libya, for example, China initially voted for the UN Security Council resolution. They engaged with members of the opposition at the same time they were engaged with Gaddafi and his regime. They supported the National Transition Council, and now they're involved in the reconstruction. This is different than their approach previously, but again, I think it's tied to the fact that it was based on a decision that China will need to work with Libya, given its huge oil investments in Libya and the presence of 30,000 Chinese laborers in Libya. So this shift of Chinese policy, foreign policy, in this particular case, is not based on a decision that China needs to work with other countries for common good or to make the world a better place. It's tied really to their domestic agenda. It's tied really to their desire to continue the economic development. A key foreign policy focus for China will be its relationship with the United States. With the political transitions in China and in the United States completed, both sides are now working to build a more positive and constructive relationship built on enhanced cooperation. I spent last week in Washington meeting with officials at the NSC, State Department, DOD, and there's a great deal of thinking right now about how to reorient the U.S.-China relationship from what we have now as a heavy focus on competition and a heavy security focus, shifting that to more of a focus on active engagement and on cooperation. And given that Xi Jinping will be focused on these significant domestic issues, I do think it's unlikely that he will want to move China to a more confrontational stance with the United States, although he will be under pressure not to appear to concede to the United States or to be giving in to United States interests. Xi Jinping is also familiar with the United States, with American domestic foreign policy and military leadership. He's visited the United States. He visited the United States early on in his career and spent time in the state of Iowa. And he traveled to the United States before he became president of China, was in Washington, D.C., went back to Iowa to see the people that he had met 25 years prior, and then he spent time in Los Angeles. Foreign policy elites in both countries now are trying to flesh out the concept that Xi Jinping raised on his last trip, which is this idea of a new type of great power relations. And you have experts and scholars in China trying to sort of flesh that out. Xi Jinping proposed that during his trip, and now people are trying to fill in the content. What does that mean? If we had a new type of great power relations between the U.S. and China, what would be the elements of that, and how would that look? So I can talk more about U.S.-China relations in the Q&A. There's a lot to talk about with the pivot and what the U.S. policy will be going forward. But my own sense is that at this point in time, the two sides are trying to figure out a way to build a more constructive and positive relationship going forward. In my own view, it will require finding issues that the U.S. and China can work on and make progress on in ways that benefit China and benefit the United States. You know, for many years, when I served in the government, we used this language that says there is virtually no issue, no global issue today that we're not dealing with that we can solve without cooperation from China. And as policymakers, we thought that this sort of we raised China's stature and perhaps incentivize them to become involved more on dealing with global challenges. in a cooperative way with other countries. What I've discovered over the last couple years in Beijing is that what Chinese leaders heard when we say that is that the United States wants China's help, that the United States has these challenges and it wants China as a sub-partner to help it resolve these issues in a way that benefits the United States. And it's remarkable. So in some senses, we're talking past each other. Some Chinese leaders say, if we get involved on these global issues, this will take away from our ability to handle our domestic issues or to continue our own domestic development. And this, in fact, then will be a means by which the United States has used to then constrain China's rise or to keep China down. And so, this is something I've learned being in China over the last few years, which to me is quite remarkable, because that's not what we're trying to say. So I think we need some new language, we need a new framework for engaging China on these issues. And one small thing I think that we could do is, instead of, we often come to the Chinese with long lists of things we want to work on together. And we just assume that, these are the issues. Of course, we have common interest on these issues, so let's work on them. I think the starting point for future discussions with Xi Jinping and the leaders ought to be, what are the issues that you want to work on? And we need to get the Chinese to identify what those issues are, because only then will they be able to say, these are the issues we brought to the Americans, and these are the issues they've agreed to work on with us, so that we can resolve them in ways that will benefit China and the United States. One issue in my own mind that is an issue where we could potentially cooperate is on North Korea. And so I'd like to spend a few minutes on North Korea. This has been a major topic of discussion between the United States and China as of late. And also, I think it's an issue where, in my own view, China's calculus appears to be changing. Last week in Washington, D.C., I brought back to Washington, D.C. with me, traveling with me, 3 Chinese experts from Beijing. And we did a roundtable discussion at the Carnegie Endowment to talk about this specific issue, China's changing calculus on North Korea, and whether or not that means there's increased opportunities for cooperation. If so, how do we get to that point? Despite China's support to North Korea, despite the fact that China has consistently shielded North Korea from efforts to impose further international sanctions and to heighten North Korea's diplomatic isolation, and North Korea went ahead with its missile test in December last year, which, by the way, took place in the immediate aftermath of the 18th Party Congress. So this was the first foreign policy challenge that Chinese leaders had to deal with. And North Korea also conducted a nuclear test in February. Both of these actions, the missile test and the nuclear test, were done in complete defiance of China's wishes. China had engaged North Korea and said and asked them not to do the missile test and the nuclear test. In addition to those 2 acts, North Korea has also threatened preemptive nuclear strikes. They've declared the Korean armistice agreement invalid. They cut the emergency hotline at Panmunjom. They closed the Kaesong industrial complex. They've moved missile launchers along the coast in the run-up to Kim Il-sung's birthday in mid-April, threatened to do a missile test again. They've warned foreign diplomats to leave North Korea, including, by the way, Chinese diplomats. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry made a very strong statement in response, saying that it expected North Korea to protect its citizens and its diplomats in accordance with the Vienna Conventions. And it threatened to attack U.S. and Japan, and this has led to even more cooperation, security cooperation between the United States, Japan, and South Korea. So clearly, China's frustration is growing, given the provocative actions and the rhetoric of North Korea and its new 29-year-old head of state, Kim Jong-un. Average Chinese citizens are now expressing their displeasure quite a bit on social media, and it's just lit up the social media, and you can see strong responses to North Korean actions. But what's even more remarkable is that the Chinese elite now are beginning to question China's continued unconditional support of North Korea. In recent years, the debate within China on the North Korea issue has been dominated by the PLA and by Communist Party organizations like the International Department, who favor the unconditional backing of North Korea. They have argued that the cost of North Korean proliferation and China's international image is outweighed by the potential downsides for China of stronger pressure or additional sanctions on North Korea. This argument has talked about the downsides of a collapse of the North Korean state, which would result in floods of refugees coming from North Korea into China, which would eventually eliminate the buffer that China now enjoys between China and South Korea, which is allied with the United States. So in this debate, the PLA and other Communist Party organizations have said that that buffer state is very important for China, and China should do whatever it can do to keep that buffer state there. However, in my view, North Korean behavior is now forcefully reshaping this critical debate, and it's redefining the contours of the debate to favor a different set of Chinese authorities who are now calling for a different approach. And this is an approach that could result in greater cooperation with the United States. As the Chinese leadership continues to allow North Korea's nuclear aspirations to go unchecked, three long-term consequences for Chinese inaction are coming to the fore. First, China's approach to relations with the North Korean regime to date are beginning to run counter to Xi Jinping's vision of a strong Chinese leadership role in the Asia-Pacific. He has announced this since coming on board. He would like to see China have a much stronger leadership role in the Asia-Pacific. But China's desire to take on this leadership role is undermined by North Korea's irresponsible behavior. How could China be the guarantor of Asia-Pacific security at the same time it would tolerate or even accommodate continued provocation by North Korea? So the regional role to which China aspires may ultimately force Beijing to rein in North Korea. Secondly, North Korean belligerence is causing somewhat of an arms race, is further inflaming tensions between China. It is leading to, as I mentioned before, the enhanced efforts between the United States and Japan on security matters, on training, military training, and also on ballistic missile defense. And this, in the Chinese view, runs counter to their own interests. And further provocations by the North will push the United States, Japan, and South Korea even closer. And so this dynamic China sees very clearly and does not see this in its interest. And finally, although China continues to resist adopting a more diplomatic role internationally, it is devoting a great deal of time and energy and resources to public diplomacy efforts aimed to enhance China's image and soft power around the world. And so this continuing narrative that North Korea continues to defy China, China being its only ally in the world at every turn, and that Beijing can't do anything to persuade North Korea to be a stable and constructive actor in the region, cuts across China's goals of regional influence and eventual great global power status. So while some have argued that the recent missile test by North Korea, which for the first time put a satellite into orbit, and the third nuclear test that they conducted were tactical victories for North Korea, I have argued that they may represent the first step in North Korea losing its strongest ally and its lifeline. To be sure, China will not abandon North Korea overnight, and they will not change their overall policy overnight. They will remain cautious in response to additional provocations by the North in an attempt to avoid further instability. And I think that they will also, as they change their policy, do it fairly quietly and behind the scenes. Although this morning I saw in the news that the Bank of China has now publicly announced that it is closing one of North Korea's branch within that bank, which allows North Korea to conduct foreign exchanges. And I think this is a pretty significant move. During my discussions last week, I guess the other thing I would point out is that is of significance is that this new debate in China that's taking place is taking place precisely at the same time that Xi Jinping and the new Chinese leaders are taking the reins of power. And this is an unknown. We don't know what Xi Jinping and the new leaders, we don't know their view on North Korea. But we do know that it is causing a debate. And so the timing of this, you know, I think North Korea probably hadn't thought through that very clearly. But to be so provocative over the last several months, precisely at the same time the new leaders come up, is a risk for North Korea. During my discussions last week in D.C., I urged U.S. officials to capitalize on this window of opportunity and to help shape the debate within China in a way that could potentially deepen U.S.-China cooperation. Let me conclude and open it up. There's a lot to talk about, but let me conclude by mentioning quickly the U.S. pivot, which I talked about before, just to say that President Obama announced a rebalancing strategy in November of 2011, which was implemented, and I would expect that this will continue in his second term and with Secretary of State Kerry at the helm, Secretary of State. But the tendency in China is to believe that two things. One, that this was a move by the United States towards a more hostile approach to China. And secondly, that this was Hillary Clinton's policy, and now that Hillary Clinton has gone away, it may change. And I disagree with both. I think if you look at the language of the pivot, it clearly says that for the the U.S. rebalancing strategy to be successful in Asia, it requires a constructive and stable relationship and positive relations with China. And that moving towards a hostile policy or trying to keep China down, trying to contain China, is not is a futile effort. It is not part of U.S. policy, and is not part of the U.S. rebalancing strategy. And so we have a lot of work to do to reassure our Chinese friends that this is the case. But I've also told my Chinese friends that don't expect, because Hillary Clinton has gone away, that the rebalancing strategy will go away. This was a result of a deliberate interagency policy review, and the decisions were made by the United States President. But ultimately, the successful management of domestic economic issues in the United States and in China will be central to the future trajectory of the U.S.-China relationship. Over the long term, I'm optimistic about the future of U.S.-China relations. Our economies are so deeply connected that mutual prosperity and growth could be achieved if we're able to put things on solid footing. China and the United States share many interests, and working together to find mutually agreeable methods and strategies to reach these ends will be essential. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Paul, for both reminding us that the domestic issues are the most important issues for the new Chinese leadership, as they are in most countries, I think.
Yeah.
But also pointing to some very important developments in Chinese international relations and foreign affairs, particularly to North Korea. Now we open up for questions. Please wave your hand and indicate, present yourself.
Yes, thank you. I have my background as a Minister of Foreign Affairs, now retired. A very powerful, thoughtful discourse which you made. I want to revisit your North Korean issue and the U.S.-Chinese issue. I noted with interest what you said about possible changes in the Chinese attitude towards North Korea, but still it strikes me, doesn't China and North Korea have some fundamental interest in common? The way I see it, the main interest of the North Korean government is, of course, regime survival, terrified of a unification of the Koreas on Western premises, which I think the Chinese will share to a certain extent. So in your view, which is the bottom line? And I take it into account, it's an evolving question, so it's difficult to answer, but what, in your view, what is the bottom line the Chinese can tolerate, quote unquote, on the North Korean issue? Where do they have to say stop? you mentioned the attitude of the People's Liberation Army. Second question is on U.S.-Chinese conditions, relations, and naval rivalry. Looking back, of course, to the Anglo-German rivalry before 1914, there are some big shadows, and you see the evidently Chinese are building up their navy, afraid of, let's say, American carrier groups getting too close to the Chinese coast. Now, if you view this from, let's say, military confidence, security building perspective, what kind of bilateral negotiations, talks could be concluded between the two parties with a view to possibly lessening, reducing naval confrontation and tension? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question, and congratulations to you on your service in the Norwegian Foreign Ministry and your retirement. I look forward to that day. Very good questions. And on North Korea, China's bottom line, I think, is potentially shifting, because what it was previously, I'm not sure it is anymore. And I think that's largely because of two factors. One is China's interests are changing as China grows in power and influence and has different ambitions. And secondly, I think there is, which I did not talk about, I think there is a great deal of concern in China, among Chinese leaders, about Kim Jong-un. And Kim Jong-il, while they may have had strong views about him, I think they felt he was somebody that they could, that in their view was somewhat predictable for them, and that somebody who probably understood how far he could go. But there's been a lot of discussion among Chinese leaders. Does Kim Jong-un understand how far he can go? Is he overplaying his hand in a way that will jeopardize China's interests? And so I think this doesn't, between the U.S., it does not mean that because China's calculus is changing, that it will necessarily result in greater U.S.-China cooperation on North Korea. That is not a given. In fact, unless the United States engages China and really has a discussion about looking at where things can go in the future and whether there's a way we can do it, I think absent any real dialogue, I don't think the Chinese want to cooperate that much with the United States, primarily because they believe that the U.S. ultimate aim with North Korea is forcible regime change. And this is not in China's interest. At least they've concluded it is not in China's interest, because it would create the instability that they're trying to avoid. And so some of the Chinese scholars that have come to our center have said, we don't want to get to the point where we're cooperating with the United States to the extent that the United States could use us as a tool in achieving their ultimate aim, which is forcible regime change. Now, China does not want regime change, forcible regime change, but they do want the regime to change. And the way they want to see this happen is that that North Korea move from a military-first policy to an economic-first policy, and that they implement a reform and opening up program very similar to China did in the 80s, and that over time, North Korea become a more normal country. And then what the Chinese have said to us is, after that, we can work together to get North Korea's nuclear weapons. And the U.S. response has been, well, how long will that take? How long will it take until we will see North Korea as a more normal country? And can we wait that long to get North Korea's nuclear weapons? And so that's the tension, I think, between the United States and China right now. And so in order to find a way to cooperate that addresses each side's concern, the Chinese concern of U.S. ultimate aim is forcible regime change, and the U.S. concern that China will drag this process out so long, and that in the interim, North Korea develops this dangerous nuclear weapons program and potentially proliferates it to other countries. We've got to find a way to bridge those differences. And if we can do that, then I think that there are ways that we can cooperate. On your question of the rivalry between the United States and China and historical analogies, I agree with you, they're out there. But it's really absolutely necessary that we avoid those. We avoid repeating those. We don't have a choice. And so I think it's up to us, to the United States and China, to develop a framework for relations that will allow us to avoid that. One of the things that I think you've seen over the last several years, if you look at U.S. policy towards China and Chinese policy towards the U.S., I think there are similarities. They're both, I think, built on a desire to actively engage one another, to reduce differences, to try to find areas where we can enhance cooperation. The United States has, at the same time, in the background, a hedging strategy. That is to say, and the Department of Defense and the Pentagon work on this considerably, and other agencies, if China develops in ways that we determine are inimical to our own interest, we have this ability to respond. Surprise, surprise, China has the same hedging strategy. If you look at China's military modernization, they're developing weapons systems and capabilities that are clearly designed with a U.S. scenario in mind. They're developing weapon systems that can take out U.S. capabilities, one-strike sort of systems that can take out an aircraft carrier, can take out some military capability that gives the United States the advantage. This is, I think, a fairly normal thing. I think most countries have some sort of hedging strategy. I think the problem for us is, as I mentioned in my talk, the hedging strategies of the United States and China have become one of the dominant features of the U.S.-China relationship. It becomes part of the discourse, as opposed to the active engagement, more positive approach. And so we have to figure out a way to establish this framework where the hedging strategy goes to the background, and that what's worked on and given the most amount of energy is the active engagement and attempts to develop positive cooperation. The pivot that the United States announced, while I agree with the elements of the pivot, I think it's the right thing to do. We've had a security and an economic and diplomatic presence in Asia for several decades, and it hasn't always been consistent. We've modified and adjusted it over the years. But we've never, at least as I can remember, felt the need to announce it so publicly, and to announce it in real security terms. As we're drawing down our military forces in Afghanistan and Iraq, we're going to pivot to Asia. And that naturally conjures up images, correlation of forces and Cold War type thinking. And so I think we've got to do a better job of talking about our strategy in Asia and not making it so security focused. Teddy Roosevelt had a saying, walk softly and carry a big stick. We can make security adjustments without trumpeting them. And China will recognize to a large extent why those are being made. But I think we've gotten to a point now where we've got to, as I mentioned, get the hedging strategy out of the major sort of dynamic of the U.S.-China relationship and move towards a more positive approach geared towards cooperation.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Just picking up on the North Korea issue. Yeah. You said that one element or possible avenue is to the Chinese kind of enter into some kind of modernization effort in North Korea and then leave the nukes there. And the issue then is how and to what extent can the U.S. accept this and the kind of the time frame, etc. But in what kind of role, if any, could the international community, apart from the kind of the main actors in the system, play in kind of let's say maintaining and keeping this time frame? Do you see a role for them at all?
Well, that's a good question. China's desire to see North Korea reform and open up economically is not a new feature. This is something they've been trying to do for a long time. Behind the scenes, in their own diplomatic engagement with North Korea, If you look back several years ago, Kim Jong-il came to China on a visit. He doesn't fly. When he was alive, he didn't fly. He was afraid of flying. And so he always took the train. And it was interesting, several years ago when Kim Jong-il went to China, the tour that Chinese leaders put him on was to send him to Dalian first, along the coast, and then to Shanghai. And these are two coastal cities that have really benefited by the reform and an opening up. And when you go to these cities, they're very impressive cities, you know, modern buildings, and you know, you look on with astonishment at how much has been accomplished. And so this was a deliberate attempt to really try to get Kim Jong-il to recognize the benefits of a reform and opening up, but it still hasn't worked, and I think the North Koreans, obviously the regime sees some potential downsides of opening up a society that's been closed for so long and has been subjected to North Korean propaganda for so long. And there's this risk that if North Korean people see what's really happening outside of North Korea, and it's different than the story that they've been told for many decades, obviously brings many risks to the regime. So the outside role for the international community is a difficult one. You know, clearly the key players in this are South Korea and North Korea. It is, you know, the Korean Peninsula, so we have to remember that. The United States and China, Japan, and Russia have been the members of the six-party talks. But I think, you know, for countries, I think at this point in time I can think of two roles. And one would be for countries that have relations with North Korea to engage North Korea, both to find out what's happening in North Korea, but also to try to get a better sense of what they're thinking and what they see as their future. Because right now we're in a bad spot because we don't have any dialogue, very little dialogue, and it's not any. We don't have very little dialogue with North Korea. Even the Chinese, you know, have tried to send officials from time to time and have been prevented from doing so. So I think, you know, we're in a better position when we are dialoguing with North Korea. You know, I'd point out often that in the Bush administration, when we were not engaged with North Korea in the early years, that's when North Korea developed 38 kilograms of weaponized plutonium. When we were engaged with North Korea at the end of the administration, we were making some progress on dismantling or disabling North Korea's nuclear program. So, and you know, we didn't obviously solve the problem and we didn't make great progress, but at least we weren't moving backwards. So I think it would be good to get to the point where we're speaking again. It's difficult now given what's happened as of late. And so countries that do have some you know, some ability to engage, I think, would be helpful in knowing what the thinking is. Secondly, I guess, is to engage, you know, China and South Korea and the United States, and keep it on the agenda as an issue, and to try to figure out ways where we can, you know, because if we can get the United States, China, South Korea, and Japan all on the same sheet of music, speaking with one voice, then I think this will have a significant impact. So in the aftermath, for example, of North Korean provocation, if we're all able to speak with one voice to say to North Korea, this is unacceptable, that potentially this could break this 2 decades worth of this pattern of North Korean brinksmanship. Right now, when North Korea conducts its brinksmanship, there's often tension between China and the United States. And as long as that happens, North Korea will see to its advantage to continue to do that, because it will create the dynamics that it's hoping to create.
Excellent. I don't see, it's a very quiet group of people here. Oh, over.
My name is Lars Lenson, former Norwegian ambassador. You didn't mention the TPP. I mean, you've talked about the need to get over in a more positive atmosphere and so on, but the realities on the ground seems from Bush, in Bush's period, in my opinion, the relationship between China and United States was much better than during the last few years, and that has to do with the cyber issue, the rare earth issue, the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and so on. And in addition, you have the TPP, which is designed in a way that China doesn't really fit in. So it seems to me that the realities on the ground are not so very positive at the time being when we take all these issues into consideration. Could you please comment on that?
Absolutely, thank you. Well, there are certainly issues in the relationship. You know, in the U.S.-China relationship, we've always had issues on the positive side of the agenda, and we've always had issues on the negative side of the agenda. So that in fact is not a new feature. And in most bilateral relationships, you have both positive and negative issues. And you mentioned cyber, South China Sea, East China Sea, rare earth. Mentioned some of those. I think South China Sea, East China Sea is something that we really need to dedicate time and energy to figuring out ways to avoid conflict and avoid additional problems. Cyber is a very important topic, and we are only now beginning to figure out how to actually engage China on this issue, because it's so complicated and involves so many different actors and different agencies. You know, it's hard to know if you decide you want to engage, which we've decided, it's hard to know which agency to engage. You could engage the foreign ministry, but you know, a lot of this is being done out of the PLA or out of other organizations, and so we're only really now beginning to engage the Chinese and on this issue, and I think it's very high on the list of our concerns. President Obama raised it in his initial phone call with Xi Jinping as an issue that he wants to work on with the Chinese. The Chinese say that they're also victims of cybercrime, cyber warfare. So they also say that, you know, that in history they were not at the table when international rules and norms were established. And so in the area of cyber warfare, I think there's still a lot to be developed in terms of international rules and norms. So I see it as an opportunity for China to come to the table and to begin talking about how we can begin to resolve some of these issues and create a governance system going forward where China then has skin in the game and has had some part of making those rules. On the TPP issue, I think this is a difficult one for China. It has gotten wrapped up into the U.S. pivot to Asia as something that's targeted at China. But in fact, the TPP was not created by China. It was not developed by China. It was created by 4 other countries in the Asia-Pacific. And the United States initially wasn't sure it wanted to sign on to it. It's a framework that moves beyond just tariffs, and it goes to, you know, behind the border type of, it takes sort of the trade agreements to the next level and deals with other issues like access and of course in the Chinese case the national relationship with companies. And so the United States signed on to it in the Bush administration, at the very end of the Bush administration. And so clearly well before the Obama administration announced the pivot. And it's not an exclusive club. Any country can sign up to it. I think China has decided that it's not going to sign up to it because there are requirements in it which they feel they cannot meet. Now, it's another question whether it would be good for China and good for the region if China did agree to at least aspire to the things that are in the TPP. And there I think we can say, I have said, I hope China aspires to join the TPP someday, because I think that would be good for China, which they have to decide, but I think it would be good for the region in terms of trade architecture and in terms of high goals. It is a very high quality, high standards framework. And I hope that China puts it on its list of something to aspire to in the future.
Okay, excellent. Over here.
My name is Alnes. I've been working on bank development and restructuring in East Asia and in Africa and in Eastern Europe and Soviet, former Soviet. And I look at these countries as well as our own continent, Europe, which is soon left out in the dark in the world conditions. At least it's going that way, it seems to put it a little bit bluntly. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about the Chinese perception on Europe in this other context that you have been speaking of now. And if you put it at the end, then a few words on Norway and the situation after the last peace award, Nobel Peace Prize award. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your question. You know, in the aftermath of the economic crisis in 2008, I think, you know, China looked both at the EU and the United States. And, you know, China came through the economic crisis relatively unscathed. And so there was a short time period there where you saw fairly confident China, you know, sometimes bordering on a little bit of hubris. And so I think in the Chinese view, both the EU and the United States were sort of out of the picture for a while. But the reality is that the EU is coming back. The United States is figuring out ways to get its economy back in order. And China is now very worried about its own economic future and whether or not it can make this transition. So I think we've gotten back to a little reality as of late in China. And so I don't think that China discounts the EU. I think China considers the EU an important partner globally, and does put priority on the EU and trying to find ways, in addition to trade and commercial activity, to enhance its relationship with the EU. I think it considers it an important actor. Your second question is on Norway. You know, it's a very difficult issue, and I've had a lot of discussions with this over the last few days. You know, I think my own view, I think, you know, China's taken it too far. I mean, it's, you know, this is, you know, this is an issue. First of all, as far as I know, it's not a decision that was made by the Norwegian government, but yet the diplomatic relations are being held hostage as a result. And so, you know, I think Norway has handled it very well, which is basically, you know, kept the high ground and is ready to engage China when China decides that it's ready to do so again. And there's no easy answers, but I think Norway has taken the high ground, and I think it's time, you know, for China to review its own position on this and move beyond it.
Excuse me, just to add on that question, is there any chance that the new leadership in China will see this differently from the previous one?
I think it's possible. You know, unfortunately, the timing right now is not the best because, you know, the leadership is new. They're still getting their footing. They're still consolidating their own base of support. This is not a time where they can appear to be weak or they can appear to be making concessions. I think, you know, as they build their base of support and become stronger and more confident over time, I think then we'll really see sort of what the views of the new leadership are and the directions that they want to go. You know, there's a lot of discussion. Why is Xi Jinping courting the military, traveling around to so many military organizations and meeting with military leaders? There's a positive way to see this, which is he recognizes that building up his support, his base of support within the PLA, will give him greater flexibility in the future. If he doesn't have the PLA supporting him, then he'll be limited to the degree to which he can implement bold policy and direction in the future. So I think this is an important time where the leadership builds its base of support, establishes its confidence, and then after we'll see true colors of the new leadership, which we don't know yet.
Okay, over here. No, yeah, further down there first, and then you.
Hi, my name is Anne Hansen, and you were mentioning, you were touching upon the issue of the respective US-China hedging strategies. And I know there is one issue which really complicates this diplomatic situation between the US and China, and that is the Taiwan issue. I was wondering if you could say anything about the current situation in that regard, with regards to the Taiwan issue and the new leadership and the US relations. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your question. It's interesting, you know, when I was working on China in the government, and in China, Taiwan, and Mongolia in my portfolio, when we would meet with Chinese leaders, you know, we had our agenda that we wanted to talk about, but Chinese leaders would spend, you know, a good amount of time lecturing us about Taiwan, our policy with Taiwan. And we couldn't get to the other agenda items on our list often. It is not brought up by the Chinese side anymore, as far as I can tell, or very little. And I think that's because Taiwan and the mainland are beginning to work through those issues themselves and to establish greater trade relations. There's an economic framework agreement which they've agreed to. There's more exchanges, and they're doing it in a way that takes into account the concerns of both sides. And I think, you know, U.S. policy is that it is up to Taiwan and the mainland to work out themselves the future arrangements. And as long as those can be achieved without coercion from China, if they're achieved in a way that the Taiwan people accept and the people on the mainland accept, then that's consistent with our own policy. So as of late, it has not been a major topic of discussion. Now, it does become a major topic of discussion when we sell weapons to Taiwan. And, you know, if the military buildup opposite Taiwan continues unabated, we have obligations under the Taiwan Relations Act to support Taiwan. And we'll continue to do that, and I think until we see that the situation changes. But we do that in discussions with our friends in Taiwan and based on their needs at the time.
Okay, Jorge.
Victor Yu from Taiwan.
Yeah.
I actually was about to ask the same question.
I wondered if she took your question away.
But I would like to add a few points here. Thank you very much for the insightful speech. Taiwan has started to engage with China 5 years ago. Before that, Taiwan is also one of the flashpoints, the potential flashpoints in China. 5 years on, we had 18 agreements signed with China. Enormous trade, 30%, more than 30% of our trade with China. Yeah. And daily scheduled air flights between Taiwan and China, 84 flights every day between the two sides.